time for another video. We're gonna start Monster Squad. I'm really excited. I said in the Zork Nemesis stream that I was gonna wait to do this till we had a better grip on entropy, but I think we'll just roll the entropy discussion into the movie. The pictures are off in their own world in this movie, telling their own story. And it's a very psychologically rich and complex story. Or it seems to me anyway. So actually, maybe I should zoom out for a moment and we can have a slightly higher level meta discussion about what it is we even do on this channel when it comes to looking at these weird movies. Since I think we're going to be looking at Monster Squad for a while, it probably does make sense actually to attach a little bit of a kind of intro to synchronic film analysis, or whatever we're calling this. Try to forget everything you think you understand about what a movie is. Because really, we don't know what a movie is. That's usually my first argument about this stuff. Is that a movie is something very complicated. It's this dense sort of pattern, audio-visual pattern box that flashes pictures at you at a rate of 24 a second, usually, and with audio on top of it, for usually somewhere between an hour to 2 to 3 in a kind of session. And I want to suggest that just the complexity of that information in the cybernetic sense, right, which just means the number of states that this thing can assume over the course of that hour or 2 or 3 is rich enough that we're dealing with a real transcendental complexity on the whole. By which I mean something more complex than you can consciously hold in your head at once. In fact, it's way, way, way past that. I mean, try sometime to play back in your head a complete film from start to finish with like state-accurate richness. So I don't mean just kind of stick figures or little flashes of scenery. I want to know where the Coke cans are, you know? I want to know what direction the shadows are facing on the floor of a given scene, you know? Now, I want to know those things because I'm a crazy person and I think that there might be real information embedded in those kinds of details. But I just mean in the context of this thought experiment, you know, to establish the fact that when we're talking about a film, we're dealing with something that is just a very deep question mark to start with. There are all kinds of bizarre questions one can ask about the nature of these things, these complex pattern sets that are expansive relative to our narrow window of conscious focal attention, you know? That's why cinema has this kind of ride-like effect, by the way. When you watch it, you tend to get very immersed and kind of feel pulled through it often in a way that makes analyzing it a little difficult. That's why we slow films way, way down here. One of the reasons is it breaks that that particular aspect of the flow where you feel like you don't have time to think about the meaning of a thing because you're already in the next event. Film tends to progress at a clip that tracks the rate of conscious experience. I mean, think about your life, right? Like if you're experiencing something with a lot of complexity and just a density of information, like let's say you're in a fight, like a verbal fight with someone, it's a big, terrible argument. You're going to be in the flow of that argument because your consciousness can only kind of track so many variables at once, and there's all this intense emotional stuff going on, and you're trying to articulate something, blah, blah, blah. So you're going to be very kind of tied to the present without a lot of ability to kind of frontal lobe, like, analyze. And it's only going to be later, upon reflection, that you end up maybe integrating the rest of those details. The way that you can do that later is because your memory is running kind of unconsciously and is capturing a lot of that detail for you so that you can analyze it later. Also, though, your unconscious is processing that information live. It has its own ideas about what's going on. It's doing a lot of things in parallel, probably, to what your conscious mind is doing. And so for that reason, I think that cinema, because its flow rate, this 24 frames a second, is enough to convince your brain that it's in a live experience, it means that cinema has the opportunity to communicate things to you unconsciously. You don't have time to catch it all consciously, and so by moving at this fast rate, it can put things on the screen that if you're going to know about them, you're only going to know about them subliminally. And so that's the other reason we slow films down here, is so that we can look at the areas of film that have been engineered to have unconscious effects on the viewer. We can see those things explicitly and say, aha, Drecker was up to something here. He put a little detail here that might foreshadow something for you unconsciously, or etc. It so happens that over the course of doing this kind of work, though, you will start to encounter areas of what I call the microsymbolic plane, which is, say, largely the background of films, but also things that are happening too quickly. It really just means anything that's happening in the subliminal regions of the film's communicational architecture, structure, whatever you can call it. It just so happens that you will start to notice things in those areas that seem to be meaningfully interrelated, as if they were authored, like some of these little deliberate narrative foreshadowing things you can notice going on down there. But it's like around that stuff, or kind of interleaved with that stuff, often will be these other strange interconnections that you might notice when you start to clue into small details in a work of art. And these other connections ultimately can be identified by way of noticing a uniqueness of style, a coherence of style. So this is what happened to me. I was watching movies, and really, I mean, I was quarantining before anyone was quarantining, you know? I was quarantining from my broken existence and trying to make sense of myself and of the world, which I no longer understood. And I was looking at these films in a much deeper way. I was looking at them as cultural texts, myths, stories that might help me make sense of my reality again. And so I was trying to understand them as deeply as I could. And because I'm an artist and a nerd, I was also just became very interested in at that time in the apparatus of cinema and all of these aspects of how it's made, and in the particularities of different authors and directors and their unique identities and how they were expressed in these films. And in particular, I became very interested in John Carpenter, because his authorship was so pointed to me. It's like, wow, that's a John Carpenter movie. And you can recognize it right away. You don't need to see his... I mean, he puts his name on the top of all of his films, you know. It's John Carpenter's Halloween, etc. But he doesn't need to. I mean, his style is just infused into every single decision. But then while I was watching those films, John Carpenter films in particular, and eventually many other films, I started to notice in the microsymbolic plane something like another author. It just seemed like there were other things, other details that seemed clearly arranged intelligently and meaningfully, but they were kind of about this other thing, this other story that seemed to be about consciousness and awareness, and a lot of weird things about unions of opposites, and even like weird little nods to like specific gods and goddesses and things, it seemed. And so I had this big question for a long time, which was, you know, what is all this, and how is it in the film? And so initially, of course, I just assumed, well, it's, you know, somehow it's John Carpenter. He's the author of the film. What else could it be? It's some deeper level of authorship in John's movie making. But then it started to seem like some of these things caught up in this weird, like, psychological layer of John's films seemed to be very anticipatory of certain events that occurred much later in history. In particular, to be anticipatory of the 9/11 event. Now, when I say this, what do I mean? And first of all, I say it now with a kind of a casualness that I would not have been able to have afforded when I first became aware of all this stuff. It took me some time to even sort of allow myself to begin to recognize these strange aspects of the films. But eventually it became so pervasive in my perception that I had to confront it. And so I'm still, in a certain way, in a process of confronting it. Although I think now I've finally arrived at some basic peace with this. And so anyway, this is already threatening to spiral into a much bigger thing than I wanted it to be. I just want to sort of give the big picture outline here, though, that there are regions of the film that seem to be authored unconsciously. Part of that is going to be the personal unconscious of the local director that made the film. But there's going to be a deeper region of unconscious organization that tracks the collective unconscious. And the collective unconscious really seems to be some kind of group effect that is situated a little bit outside of space and time, because it seems to be able to pull through information about events in the future. And so Monster Squad is one of these films. It is a major 9/11 precogger, in my view. So we need to bring all that into Monster Squad. All of that I just got through the most insane rambling explanation of it. Probably didn't even make sense, but hopefully it'll make sense as we just kind of jump into the process. We're doing all of that, but then also we're going to be looking at this in terms of blood pyramid stuff, because this film really seems to somehow speak to it. Again, it's hard to know often when doing video alchemy at what level the thing is mapping. Is it really the case that there's information about the blood pyramid contained within Monster Squad? Well, actually, I think in Monster Squad's case that there is somehow. There's clearly some attention being paid to ideas about social hierarchies and how societies come together or break apart around them. That seems to me quite conscious. So I think Monster Squad deserves more credit, really, than it gets in just a perfectly kind of normal, not non-local sort of way. I just think that the authors were infusing some things about this stuff into the film, probably. But some of it is so specific, and in particular, just kind of on the imagistic level, the fact that Dracula is the main monster in this film and so on, that the bloodiness of the blood pyramid seems to come through in this film in a particular way that makes me wonder if there isn't a good deal of unconscious assist going on, you know? So anyway, that means that we're going to be looking at some cybernetic stuff here. In particular, some stuff to do with entropy and how entropy relates to models and knowledge and belief as a repression of uncertainty, i.e. of entropy, within the modeling system. So we can bring all the cybernetic stuff. Then also, I have up here, finally, we'll talk about why this is up here, Gerard's Violence and the Sacred. Because all this business about ritual sacrifice seems to be encoded in this film at the same time. So, wow, this film is a real doozy, and I expect we're going to be living in it for quite a while. So, one last thing before we read this little bit of Gerard and then finally start the movie, just about the sort of the practice of this. I try to be as receptive as I possibly can to every glimmer of an intuition that I have when I watch these films, because I don't know what the film has to tell me yet. I'm always trying to remember it's transcendental. I feel that if I can learn to understand Monster Squad, then I will have kind of de facto understood the relationship between all of these pieces: entropy, blood pyramid, synchronicity, ritual sacrifice. The assumption, of course, with these sorts of adventure games, and this is always ended up being true so far, is that whenever I feel that way, it's actually that I'm about to open up just a much wider, chasm into the mystery, you know? So there's also a bit of fear about it. And this film, Monster Squad, it has all of that on it. It has that shine on it. It terrifies me, this movie. I find it hilarious. I have the sort of the total amount of paradoxical feelings one could have about something truly alien. So I want to sort of, I feel as if I have to set this stuff up now with the correct gravity, because otherwise it just, people think they know what this stuff is. It's Monster Squad. It's this stupid movie from the 80s, you know. How can you be taking it so seriously? How ridiculous, you know. But it really isn't ridiculous if you think about it as a deposit of psychological events, you know. Some bunch of people got together and mixed their minds together in this crazy psychedelic way that was also existing in conversation with the culture at the time. There's all these historical elements embedded in there as well, you know. It's like this state capture of this big creative system that was taking place, and so much of it is accidental. But then when you look at the details of those accidents, often you'll find that those accidents happened in ways that seem very unfair, you know, in the sense of like a fair coin. It seems like the probabilities are not, they're not really, this stuff isn't random down there. It's clustered around meaning centers. Well, so anyway, many complex things to consider there about where those meaning centers are. Are they in your head as the analyzer, or are they in the thing? The truth is it's somewhere in between. So we're dealing with something very boundary dissolving in the subject-object sense right away when we watch a film, always. It's just that my practice tries to pull that out and make it central, make it sort of bake it into the global frame in which we do our hermeneutic work. So, okay, now we're going to read this Gerard thing, because really, Monster Squad is a crazy movie. It opens right away with some kind of intense ritual sacrifice idea. We need to get our bearings now in a more serious way on this question of sacrifice, violence, and spirituality. And Gerard is going to be instructive in that regard. I have to say, I don't consider myself a Gerardian in the way that I would probably be comfortable describing myself as a Jungian. Now, I don't get along exactly with every nook and cranny of Jung's system either, but it's basically like so resonant that I'm comfortable saying, yeah, sure, I'm a Jungian, obviously. So we're just going to read a little section of this. Before we do that, I'm going to get a drink of water because I'm feeling very parched. Violence is not to be denied, but it can be diverted to another object, something it can sink its teeth into. Such, perhaps, is one of the meanings of the story of Cain and Abel. The Bible offers us no background on the two brothers, except the bare fact that Cain is a tiller of the soil, who gives the fruits of his labor to God, whereas Abel is a shepherd who regularly sacrifices the firstborn of his herds. One of the brothers kills the other, and the murderer is the one who does not have the violence outlet of animal sacrifice at his disposal. This difference between sacrificial and non-sacrificial cults determines, in effect, God's judgment in favor of Abel. To say that God accedes to Abel sacrificial offerings but rejects the offerings of Cain is simply another way of saying, from the viewpoint of the divinity, that Cain is a murderer, whereas his brother is not. A frequent motif in the Old Testament, as well as in Greek myth, is that of brothers at odds with one another. Their fatal penchant for violence can only be diverted by the intervention of a third party, the sacrificial victim or victims. Cain's jealousy of his brother is only another term for his one characteristic trait, his lack of the sacrificial outlet. Doesn't Gerard have a great style? According to Muslim tradition, God delivered to Abraham the ram previously sacrificed by Abel. This ram was to take the place of Abraham's son Isaac, having already saved one human life. The same animal would now save another. What we have here is no mythical hocus pocus, but an intuitive insight into the essential function of sacrifice, gleaned exclusively from the scant references in the Bible. Another familiar biblical scene takes on new meaning in the light of our theory of sacrificial substitution, and it can serve in turn to illuminate some aspects of the theory. The scene is that in which Jacob receives the blessing of his father Isaac. Isaac is an old man. He senses the approach of death and summons his eldest son, on whom he intends to bestow his final blessing. First, however, he instructs Esau to bring back some venison from the hunt, so as to make a savory meat. This request is overheard by the younger brother, Jacob, who hastens to report to his mother, Rebekah. Rebecca takes 2 kids from the family flock, slaughters them, and prepares the savory meat dish, which Jacob, in the guise of his elder brother, then presents to his father. Isaac is blind. Nevertheless, Jacob fears he will be recognized, for he is a smooth man. Rebecca has the idea of covering Jacob's hands and the back of his neck with the skin of the slaughtered goats. And when the old man runs his hands over his younger son, he is completely taken in by the imposture. The kids serve in 2 different ways to dupe the father, or in other terms, to divert from the son the violence directed towards him. In order to receive his father's blessing rather than his curse, Jacob must present to Isaac the freshly slaughtered kids made into a savory meat. Then the son must seek refuge, literally, in the skins of the sacrificed animals. The animals thus interpose themselves between father and son. They serve as a sort of insulation, preventing the direct contact that could lead only to violence. You see how this already relates to these blood pyramid ideas. I think there are kind of multiple levels of nested sacrifice going on in a given blood pyramid. Here are the hierarchies. It's as if there's the potential for rivalry between father and son, you know? There's going to be a violence because this son is trying to sort of deceive his father in some way, and for other complicated reasons due to the story, I assume, etc. And instead of them working out the consequences of the of the reality of that situation, because of the social pressures that exist there, they're going to press that violence in some other direction. And so here in this story, it's kind of pressed in the direction of these animals in this kind of implicit imagey way, though. Notice how Gerard is treating the material, right? It's like just the presence of these animal skins and the existence of this savory meat dish. You know, these are important details to Gerard's interpretation because they illuminate this idea about sacrificial substitution. The sacrifice is made because it stands in for something else that isn't going to be expressed, namely the violence between, well, if it ends up being this big sacrificial context, let's say like a big scapegoat mechanism, then it's like the sum total of violences that would break out between all the members of the society end up getting focused onto a single sacrificial victim who stands in for the violences of the society as a whole, something like that. So, sorry, that's just my very quick sort of what is Gerard even talking about with this sacrificial substitution idea. How does it relate to the blood pyramid? And I should say, just sort of, I'll mention it here because we are about to look at a film in the Red Twins constellation. How does this all relate to the notion of the Red Twins? Because this notion of twinness, of substitution, is so central to these ideas about sacrifice. It's so much so that Gerard has even selected a Bible story here about twins, one of which is a redhead, by the way. So if that all sounded like nonsense, you're going to have to watch the 6th century back archives. 2 sorts of substitution are telescoped here. That of one brother for another, and that of an animal for a man. Only the first receives explicit recognition in the text. However, this first one serves as the screen upon which the shadow of the second is projected. See, I like Gerard's approach, and I can see that he's a brain who is afflicted by the same the same kind of problem I have. It's like, this can't ever really think that these stories are just these simple little surface stories. I just don't buy it. People are doing a much more complex thing when they create a story. A lot of it's unconscious, but that's just the incredibleness of it. So much meaning and so much profound meaning about our nature gets caught up in the art that we produce. Really, if you understand this, then you'll understand the degree to which art criticism is truly in its infancy. It hasn't even begun, because it doesn't even recognize the existence of the primary author. The unconscious itself, of course. Once we have focused attention on the sacrificial victim, the object originally singled out for violence fades from view. The sacrificial substitution implies a degree of misunderstanding. Its vitality as an institution depends on its ability to conceal the displacement upon which the rite is based. It must never lose sight entirely, however, of the original object, or cease to be aware of the act of transference from that object to the surrogate victim. Without that awareness, no substitution can take place, and the sacrifice loses all efficacy. So that's interesting. Girard's kind of saying that it has to hover a sort of both slightly above and slightly below the subliminal threshold. To see the situation clearly is already to position oneself outside of it to some degree. Now, that's not entirely true. It's possible to perceive it and still participate in it. And indeed, it may be impossible to completely disentangle oneself from the blood pyramid. I spoke in that last video about trying to dismantle it in some way. What I kind of meant by that was fix a society that is that has privileged the blood pyramid and allowed it to gain control of the social fabric. That's not very good. The blood pyramid ought to be compensated for by other sorts of things, because it is, in fact, just an aspect of human beings. It's a dangerous one that oughtn't to be in that position of authority over us. It's very bad that this society on the whole has devolved in such a way that to create these conditions that have allowed another blood pyramid to flourish, you know. But anyway, in order to do that, to whatever extent is possible to do that, it's going to precisely hinge on pushing the thing completely into consciousness. It works and reproduces itself when it sits like this. When all of the violence transference, that sort of blood deferment process is going on beneath the surface. If we can expose that and make that visible, then maybe we have a chance of, you know. So, without that awareness, no substitution can take place, and the sacrifice loses all efficacy. The biblical passage discussed above meets both requirements. The narrative does not refer directly to the strange deception underlying the sacrificial substitution, nor does it allow this deception to pass entirely unnoticed. Rather, it mixes the act of substitution with another act of substitution, permitting us a fleeting, sidelong glimpse of the process. The narrative itself, then, might be said to partake of a sacrificial quality. It claims to reveal one act of substitution, while employing this first substitution to half conceal another. Half conceal. That's a great term of art there. There is reason to believe that the narrative touches upon the mythic origins of the sacrificial system. Okay, that was a little taste of Girard. I really recommend reading him. Like I said, I find much to disagree with in his thinking as well, but his eye for kind of mythic significance and unconscious structure in myths is really finely tuned, I think. And I think he exposes something absolutely critical and fundamental with this notion of generative violence and mimetic desire and sacrificial substitution. I buy the basic picture. I just think it needs glued. It needs to be glued into a larger picture, which I'm going to endeavor to do hopefully someday. It's important to keep those kinds of goals alive in situations like this where we're staring down a lot of darkness. I don't want to kind of just blow through either the weirdness of our situation here at the moment, you know, COVID-wise, I mean. But there's only so much one can focus on these horrible things. And anyway, we're going to be focusing on it a bit because, like I said, I think this film contains a little bit of COVID precog, maybe. It at least is synchronistically kind of hewn into my weird process about that stuff. So, without further ado, let's watch Monster Squad. Let's start with 0.5 and see how that does us. I can turn off this terrible lamp now. That's better. Maybe it's good. I don't know. It's just, part of my process is like watching these films a little bit in the dark, you know? I consider that I'm trying to place myself into communication with something real here. So it's important to sink into the picture as much as possible. I'm always interested in the logos that get attached to these movies. TriStar with this kind of Pegasus theme. And here we have this very 1980s typeface. That would be a microgramma D-bold extended, I think. In any case, it's the same typeface that Casio used on all of their wristwatches and so on. Okay, so we begin this film with a text crawl in blood red, of course, because although this film is called Monster Squad, it really is in some way a Dracula movie. Like, primarily. Dracula is the big head monster in this film. 100 years before this story begins, it was a time of darkness in Transylvania. A time when Dr. Abraham Van Helsing and a small band of freedom fighters conspired to rid the world of vampires and monsters, and to save mankind from the forces of eternal evil. So right away I find something unusual here, which is just the word choice of freedom fighters. It just seems a little contextually dislocated from the rest of this, you know? Okay, we're 100 years ago in Transylvania. Abraham and a band of freedom fighters conspired to rid the world of vampires and monsters. Like, fighting for the freedom of human beings to be free from monsters or something. It's just a strange choice because it seems like a little political, you know? So, to save mankind from the forces of eternal evil. Which I would suppose that eternal evil here we can basically read as being blood pyramid. That would be my initial kind of idea. This is a film about how to avoid the reconstitution of the blood pyramid, maybe, on some level. They blew it. So I don't remember off the top of my head the name of the screenplay writer, but I know he's the same person who wrote The Last Action Hero. This, maybe we'll probably see it here. He has a very particular style, a quite sort of fourth wall breaking, self-aware style. There will be many jokes about the nature of movies and genre movies and so on in this film. The Monster Squad. The first image we have is a Grim Reaper holding a scythe and a kind of Celtic style Christian cross thing, maybe that kind of circle in the middle. Just a kind of like cursory little symbolic parse of that frame would suggest an idea about the death of God, maybe, or the end of Christianity in some way. If we were to read that kind of significance into that picture, but I think it's pretty fair to search for some significance like that in the opening frame of a film. It's the first picture they're showing you. It establishes the first impression, which is going to establish the overall context of the thing. So I have to say, from the pop cultural perspective, I really know nothing about this film. Sometimes we look at films where I know a lot of the... so here's like Dracula's Castle, I would suppose. Sometimes we look at films where I have a lot of prior knowledge about all the actors and how the films were made and sort of trivia about the production and so on. I don't really have any of that kind of information about this film. So anyway, I just wanted to say, if there are any Monster Squad fans out there, I'm very, very ignorant about all that kind of stuff. So if you know something I don't know that might contribute to our understanding of this, don't hesitate to drop a comment or contact me in some other way. So we go right down into this tomb zone, into the crypts. 4 flames, seems there. 1, 2, 3, 4, yes. You're going to probably notice me doing a lot more of this kind of arbitrary counting and so on. Watching this, that's just a measure of my uncertainty about what this film means. So for instance, that's going to mean noticing very stony things like the fact that the end of this W sort of looks like a 7 and so on. I may not mention every single one of these little things, that I'm noticing. Also, I'm going to be missing many things, so everyone should keep their eyes open for little gems. You don't know what might be significant, because the unconscious makes use of very small things often. And, you can kind of take those sorts of statements on whatever level you'd like, really. Goes without saying, I guess, but Maybe the unconscious makes use of small things because it's very local, kind of in your head, and it's directing your attention at those small things for some reason. And, you know, a lot of that stuff might end up just being dead ends. Some of them won't be. Some of them might be reflections of personal unconscious things that are going to tell you about something to do with you, quite personally and subjectively. Some of them will be things like Easter eggs put in there by the authors. Some of them will be things put in by the authors in a local way, but just unconsciously. Very often artists are kind of accidentally talking about their own lives in some way when they make art and so on. Those kinds of things. You might have caught a little fish like one of those. But it's possible that you've caught a really big fish, like an impression of a future event left in an artwork, or etc. At least I believe such things are possible, and believe that I've amassed quite a solid body of evidence of such things on this channel. So, because I believe that, I don't think it's at all silly to do things like count the number of torches that appear in a scene, or notice that text can be read in a dual way, or etc. You know, the theory here would be that at a higher level of mind, all these little decisions that people were making kind of quote-unquote accidentally may have actually been under the control of a higher order of organization somehow. So, if you think that just couldn't be, I don't know, I've got news for you. The world is a very strange place. So strange that we're now looking at an image of armadillos. You might ask yourself, why in the holy fuck there would be armadillos in Dracula's castle? But this is actually just an example of this film being incredibly accurate to the source material, because the original Dracula, which was 1931, but it had it put fucking here. Let's look at the clip actually. Actual armadillos in the canonical Dracula castle, and the reason for that is there is no reason. The reason is they were trying to make the film seem exotic to American audiences, and no one had ever seen an armadillo before. Who fucking knew what that was? They dropped it in there. They tried to pass it off as some kind of weird Transylvania rat or something, you know? Who knows what kind of ridiculous notion it was. But because this impossible, bizarre decision was made at the ground floor of this kind of modern myth of like Dracula movies, like, we get these armadillos now. But you see, they can function now in the context of this ritual sacrifice idea, because in fact what these things code, if you know anything about these things and about the world, they're not Transylvania rats, they're armadillos from the Americas. And you know, we were just talking about pyramid at Cholula and Aztec sacrifice and all of this, so it to me this draws a connection to the pyramid. It draws a connection between Dracula's castle and the sacrificial pyramid. And that's, strictly speaking, you know, people would call that an accident. Whoops. Just how convenient that it whoopsed that way, though, along with a million other whoopses in this movie that also seem to skew in that direction, you know. So, wow, that's really weird, though, because how could that, you know... The reason this is here is because this movie that was made way before this movie put these things in its movie for some dumb, incomprehensible reason. That's the causal reason. They could have put in any random animal in that old Dracula movie. If we really start to buy the idea, like I do, that the unconscious can manipulate things by kind of nudging people's arbitrary decisions around a little bit, particularly when it's something kind of weird and random and silly like this. Some people are making a movie and they're like, we need some weird animal here. So it was like, what's a weird animal? Armadillo. Like, it's like the first thing that came to mind or something. Or they were looking at a bunch of pictures maybe, and that's just the one that caught their eye. But both the things springing to mind and the catching of the eye are going to be under the direction of the unconscious, probably. So if we also think that the unconscious can access information non-locally, and that it knows that at a future date there's this work of art that could really benefit from having this particular symbolic structure in place, who's to say that it couldn't have just nudged it that way so that we end up with this situation later? Now, I always have the impression when describing these things in this way that we're dealing with a kind of like the kind of story that like a 4-year-old would tell themselves about a complex situation they can't understand, you know, this complete toy little model. But it's just a way of getting some kind of a bearing on the the weirdness involved in looking at art in this way, I suppose. It leads one into such considerations quite naturally. So we pan from the armadillos onto a coffin that is sort of spontaneously opening. Spiders and a very corpsey looking hand are rising out of it. And is that Dracula's hand already? I don't remember. There are multiple coffins down here. I don't think that is Dracula, because isn't Dracula going to kind of anamorph out of a bat here? Okay. We pan up and see all these little red dots. Now this is just an ominous happening to me for several reasons. Well, so the first thing I would say, and this involves a little bit of sort of overhead again of talking about like bigger channel issues, but I consider that, you know, part of what I'm doing on Sync Century is creating a big, sort of my big version of a red book, you know, which is to say, I'm trying to make a record of my interactions with this thing. Everyone's interacting with the unconscious all the time because everyone has a connection to it. And it's just sort of very fundamental to what it means to be a human being. You have an unconscious. Some people, though, for some reasons, just have maybe it's a problem, actually. It's hard to say, you know. There are benefits that arise out of it. There are also some significant disadvantages that come out of having an enhanced relationship with this thing, let's say. And that can take many forms. I think anyone who's creative has an enhanced relationship with it. But then there are the kinds of people like us here. We are really, for some reason, not only in deeper communication with it, but we're kind of consciously aware of it as this big, weird question mark. And so when you become consciously aware of it in that way, you can start to kind of very deliberately work on your relationship with it. And wow, it can really, the texture of that relationship can change. In fact, it can change very quickly and very severely if you sort of know what buttons to press with it. And or if it's just, I don't know, maybe your destiny to enter the inner temple, if you know what I mean. That's kind of how it felt for me. It seemed like as soon as I learned there was this door that I could open that led into Vortex Town, you know, it's like as soon as I'd opened that door, it was just like a million things were suddenly like, oh, hey, Jordan, there you are, finally. We've been waiting. Come over here. We have like 1,000 insane like sort of like structures like blast into your conscious ego perception. Oh, by the way, we're going to kill you 100 million bajillion times and reconstitute you just as many times. And by the end of it, you're not even going to know, like, whether or not you're, like, a human being or some kind of, like, slime alien, like, anymore, you know? And for me, too, there was a long initial period of kind of courting it, you know, of, like, gosh, there's some weird numbers on those clocks. Oh, God, that's weird. Go back to my fucking video game. Oh man, what's happening in this video game though? Look at all these weird symbols in here. Oh, fucking ignore that. I'm gonna go over here and socialize with these people. Oh no, this person is somehow responding as if they're reading my mind in a way that's like very high dimensional and repetitive. Oh fuck. I'll go over here instead and try, you know? It's like, it did have this kind of like bizarre build-up. Yes, my disc is almost full. That's somehow an appropriate statement. It had this kind of period of build, but then there was this kind of watershed, like, eruptive moment where I thought I was going to drown in it, the unconscious, that is. But I didn't. It was an alchemical bath, and I arose out of it and, to go around, you know, the next arc of the spiral. And so I'm a person who perceives that I'm now on this spiral. That is just kind of, there aren't that many of us who will say, hey, we're on the individuation arc. Like, round and round and round with this crazy thing, each time getting a little more insane, yet a little more whole. Insane, I mean here, is relative to the reality definitions of whatever culture you're living in. Kind of doesn't matter what culture, I think. By virtue of it being a society, it's a little hostile to this idea of individuation. The end result of which is that it produces people who could really end up assaulting the reality definitions that make this thing up. Okay, well, is that all in the context of? Right, I was saying, if you're a person that comes to recognize that they are on this spiral process, and I think it kind of becomes a spiral, maybe partially like because you're starting to recognize it consciously, the more aware of it you become. In other words, it seems like it starts to accelerate the degree to which you're like orbiting around it. And I keep gesturing as if we're orbiting out, but it kind of, the feeling is often more that you're orbiting ever inward towards a proximity, asymptotically, to this thing in the center. Although, Jung also says about the self, right, that it's the center and the circumference. There's a weird paradox in the spiral and in this thing, of course. But so anyway, if you're a person that is aware of it in that way, I think it comes with a certain responsibility of kind of sharing one's interactions with it, because you come to understand that they're not really for you often in a personal way. The unconscious isn't really a personal organ. I mean, it has that dimension, of course, but the personal unconscious, in my view, is quite dwarfed by the size of the impersonal unconscious. And that, by the way, is something that I would like to say, that's something that you can know more or less empirically. You can enter into a relationship with the unconscious and investigate its size for yourself. You don't take my word for it, anybody else's word. You shouldn't. You should, I don't know what you should do. That's the truth. I never sort of want to recommend that people go, like, joyriding into the unconscious in the way that, like, a Timothy Leary might have suggested people in a very irresponsible way, kind of like dunk into a psychedelic experience, because it amounts to the same thing. The psychedelic experience, I think, really is just another way of coming into extraordinarily, like, rapid-fire communication with this thing. And it has unpredictable effects, and you don't know what it's going to do to you, and I really mean that seriously. So it's a bit of a danger. However, I don't think it's so much of a danger that people shouldn't explore it a bit, because it just amounts to self-exploration. It's you, somehow, or some aspect of you, and the danger comes from the fact that you're doing something a little kind of unknown and hackery relative to what your society knows how to help you with. There isn't going to be any support, really, if you decide to undertake this sort of journey. And in fact, if you go to a mental health professional or so on with things that are occurring to you during the real meat of this process, particularly the first couple arcs around that vortex, it really might not do you. It might. I want to be very careful here, because I think people should seek out mental health assistance when they need it. But there's a particular problem to do with this particular thing, which is that people who are initiating into an interaction, a deeper relationship with the unconscious, are going to exhibit quote-unquote symptoms that, from the point of view of what these people can understand about mental health, that they're going to just view as delusions, probably. Now, it depends on who you're talking to. If you go see a Jungian analyst, they might be much more receptive to this kind of stuff. And there are many therapists that are just aware of those kinds of approaches and are going to be responsible enough and open enough to see the difference, just to know when someone is going through a real kind of shamanic journey of the soul in some way, versus someone who is really breaking away from reality in a pathological way that might require some medication or something to stabilize a bit. And unfortunately, the two things can be happening at the same time. And the boundaries between them are not always clear anyway, so it's just all a bit of a mess there. And so I just want, you know, I want to do my sort of part and be responsible always when I talk about this stuff. But at the same time, I'm so far through this door now and sort of trying to sort of figure out how to have a life like on the other side of it, that I have to adopt and practice a bit of a somewhat nonchalant attitude about it in the way that I talk about it and present it. So anyway, that was a big sort of footnote there along the way to this bigger point I was trying to make, embedded within the larger point about the fucking weird bats in the movie frame we're looking at. But I just wanted to say that because this YouTube channel amounts to a kind of a sharing of my or just a documenting and simultaneous sharing of my explorations of this area of life, I'm always looking at my sort of total art output, like the YouTube channel as a whole, for synchronistic connections. So I'm always very curious to see if there are kind of visual themes that are slowly evolving in my videos as I make them, because I'm not paying attention to that kind of stuff usually. I'm not sort of deliberately trying to foreshadow things that are going to crystallize 4, 5, 6, 6, 10, whatever videos down the road. I'm just focused usually on making my video and trying to make that coherent. But it so happens, of course, that there's a larger unconscious process going on in my creative output and in this individuation process, of course. And so there often are such emergent themes in this material. And so one of those themes, we might say, or I'm not sure if it's a theme, but a connection that it occurs to me to draw at this juncture, looking at this image, is with the opening of Moonwalker, which had all these little points of light in the crowd that Michael was entertaining. And I remarked in that video, I believe, that I thought they resembled little souls. And I would make the same observation here. I would say, again, this reminds me of little souls. Or like, and it literally here is a bunch of little eyes now. These are a bunch of bat eyes that also happen to be a lot of little red dots, which, if you know about the Red Twins constellation, is a very sort of repetitive element. We see a lot of double red dots and things like that situated in these higher order contextual circumstances that often add up to strange 9/11 references. So right away we just have a ton of these dots. Now they're red souls, though. So it implies to me, in my deranged frame, that we're dealing with a blood pyramid myth right off the bat. That was a very, very nice emergent pun. Good job, Hecky. Let's just move on. That's enough about the bats. God, we just linger on them, though. Look at how many shots there are of these fucking bat eyes. And now we're... Oh my god, this movie. Now we're looking at this little animatronic bat. That is so silly looking, I think. Like, it's such an obvious little puppet, you know? It's adorable, actually. It kind of opens this mouth. We see this thing shoot out that is now an interpolation between the bat and a human being. This is Dracula's transformation scene. You've got to remember, this is like an 80s movie. It's way before we had the ability to like actually show something morph into another thing. That stuff didn't start to happen until like The Abyss and really like Terminator 2 really sort of to bring those effects more into the popular consciousness. So at this stage of movie making, if you wanted to show a thing transform, you had to do it with discrete shots, you know. So we had a shot of the little bat puppet. Now we have a shot of a hand that is like a halfway in between a bat and a human hand. And then the next shot, I think, is just going to be Dracula, like dropping down from the ceiling. They basically just have 3 states, and that represents the transition of the bat into Dracula. These were just the limitations of filmmaking at the time. You could have done something maybe more elaborate with more states, you know, like John Carpenter's The Thing is kind of the height of what you could do with this kind of like puppet-based, like discrete shot, like transformation approach. This film is nowhere near that technically sophisticated, of course. So, this one at least they show it shrink a little bit, so we get a little bit of motion in that shot, right? And now we're just looking at a human hand. So, in fact, it's kind of a 4-shot sequence, but the transformation is complete by the 3rd shot. And now we're looking at Dracula. This is about the most unfrightening Dracula I think you could possibly imagine, no? He looks like a guy at a Halloween party dressed up as Dracula. Like, it's completely unconvincing, and he looks totally non-threatening. We've still got this cloud of bat eyes about here. And we have these ridiculous bat puppets on strings floating around over here. It's so funny. Although this is also like a very cool shot overall, I would say. Like, it's got the look and the drama. It looks like a comic book pane come to life, you know? The fact that he kind of concretizes out of a quite, like, literal cloud of witness there, I find quite interesting. It's like the infinity matrix of bat eyes, and then out of that is birthed this particular instance. It kind of tells you in a way that Dracula is a representation of a big group process or effect of some kind, or is related to something primordial and collective. I think we can read that cloud of bat eyes actually as a little imagistic representation of the collective unconscious itself, and it's sort of giving you the origin of this character considered as an archetype, as it were. It's showing you, in other words, that this is an archetypal image born out of the collective. I also find it unusual in the way of kind of my own personal synchronistic pathway, as it were. I mean, like, sort of like navigation arc through these weird possibility spaces. Because it just so happened that I was looking at this film and thinking about bats and all this stuff right before the whole Corona thing entered my awareness. It was anticipatory for me of the whole COVID-19 event, in other words, because, that thing began with bat. And also, hold on a second, I want to, I'm sorry if I'm abandoning a part of my attempt to articulate the strange, psychological layers of the film here, but I just want to say a few things rapidly about the subliminal, fundamentally, I'll just use my jargon and say the projection space surrounding COVID-19, by which I mean the associative ideas, images, contexts that connect to it. I think that vampire is kind of stamped on the thing in a number of ways. Let's list three of these ways. Maybe there are more, I'm not sure, but at least I can name these. The first is just that the thing has this big V in the middle of it. COVID. That V at the center of the alpha portion of the alphanumeric, unit that makes up the name of this thing, I would say is a good subliminal sort of trigger for a vampiric archetype. Not least of all because the shape itself also resembles a triangle. And the vampire is ultimately, I think, it would classically be interpreted as being related to the shadow, and it is. But I think the vampire is, in fact, much more particular. It's much more particularly instantiated archetype than just the shadow. The shadow is a very primordial, large-scale sort of archetype that is going to catch, which also means it's a more abstract category that's going to catch more particular instances in its net. Isn't it interesting how that works, by the way? Because on some level, that's what archetypes are. They're just kind of categorizations of pattern activities that we can observe. But, well, that's one aspect of what they are. But I think that the vampire relates particularly to things to do with the blood pyramid. It relates to suffering in the social hierarchy. The way in which we feed on the blood of others, as it were. It's just describing a dimension of the human being. The vampire, you know, we could think a lot about this archetype. There's a whole lot of sexuality coded in this archetype as well. I would say that the whole repressed landscape of sadism, masochism, all the taboo aspects of sexuality that connect to violence, because, you know, it's bloodlust that we get with the vampire, and that lust is part of it's a very central aspect of the archetype, I would say. So, we get the little subliminal implication of a pyramidal structure just in the shape of the V, and then it also happens, you know, it's sort of by way of like prior synchronistic interaction, potentially, the first letter of the word vampire that codes this archetype. So I think it's sitting right there a little bit in the title. I think also overall, somehow, I'm not sure exactly why, but COVID-19 sounds to me like a much more severe illness. It sounds like a blood illness. And I think that's partly because of the imagistic context that this language fragment sort of was delivered along with. We got this weird word. I mean, the other thing was coronavirus, right? There's a whole bunch of stuff baked into that to do with the notion of the crown. And that's quite significant in this film as well, because Dracula is, you know, the king of the vampires. He's really the king of the monsters as a whole. This film places Dracula as the kind of governing archetype within which all other sort of monsters are contained in some kind of way, I think. But anyway, we got this word package attached to an image package that had all these little red triangles on it. That's the way the virus looked in the CDC illustration. There are other illustrations of this thing out there, and it remains to be seen what ends up becoming completely canonical. But I think already this kind of this one with the red triangles was the most scary. So it's the one that the news media all latched onto right away. And when you watch mainstream news, they're all using this image over and over and over again. It's this little spiky red ball. It's a scary image, but it's an image that immediately conjures these implicit ideas to do with blood, and the blood pyramid in particular. And so we already have these little red pyramids, and then the thing is COVID with this V in the middle. It's like that sort of doubles up that vampire implicitness, you know? And then the thing originated from a bat, for fuck's sake, you know? So all those things together, my argument would kind of be, your unconscious can't help but draw the connection to a vampire. There's a lot of objective vampire structure floating around this thing, either in an accidental way, or if you believe in this sort of thing, in a synchronistic way. So there's the rough outline of all of that stuff to do with COVID. Now, what was I interrupting in order to deliver that digression? I don't remember, and it doesn't matter, I'm sure. Let's keep moving forward. We're just talking about Dracula kind of like invisoing into existence out of the bat hive mind there, and the notion that that's sort of, you know, Dracula is going to represent something to do with our collective violence, and it's connected also to notions about the dead and the raising of the dead, because we saw that hand coming out of that crypt. I guess that was just some weird little throwaway, by the way. It isn't looking as if this film is going to meaningfully pick up on that in any way. But so, okay, right away we've got torches and twin dogs. That to me conjures Hecate as an association. And that's not unusual in these films that seem to contain future transmissions. I want to note that that's part of what she does. Like, if you read the lore about her, she sends the visions and weird dreams and precognitions and so on. So the fact that we see a lot of Hecate-resonant microsymbolism in these films that seem to contain these impressions of future events, it's a very weird and significant thing. Okay, right away we're looking at two figures. One holds a torch. The other holds an apparent stick of dynamite. Hold on, let's get that back up on the screen. So my brain really wants to connect this back to that phrase freedom fighter that we noticed as being a little unusual before. This is the band of freedom fighters, and what they're doing is they're lighting dynamite. Now, this might not seem so unusual yet because it's just a single instance, but there's actually just a lot of like things getting blown up with dynamite in this movie. And so I just find it a little odd. Particularly because it's so kind of, we start zoomed in on it, and it's, have this shot of them running away. 2 figures. Here's 2 more figures. These are dead. There's some kind of a juxtaposition of the living against the dead here in this frame. Right? A group of 2 is paired with another group of 2. They're running away from another big symmetrical door structure that has our favorite kind of segmented rectangle design on it. And they're freedom fighters that are blowing it up with dynamite. You know, I don't know. It's not so distant from the space. And it's kind of right away we get something that's a bit matchy. A bit. The way it tends to work in these films is that it seems to kind of gain energy. You know, I think there's enough here because we have twinness 3 times. We have the double door, we have the 2 figures, we have the 2 skeletons. Then we have some texture detail on the door that maps to the image structure. And then we have a situation in which we have a text fragment that says freedom fighter and a bomb that's going to explode the thing that captures some of the image structure. You know, the image structure is a low-dimensional match. Very, very low dimensional. This kind of thing shows up all the time. Anytime you have like windows or doors, blinds, or you get lots of these, but it's not about that. It's about the whole set of things together. And I think there's enough here together that my sort of personal high dimensional coincidence filter is saying this is too many. There are too many elements here kind of clustered around an apparent center. And, you know, when I watched this film, knowing nothing about it, other than the fact that I knew there was a weird Fox photo scene downstream and that I had just been given this image as a still, I made the call at this stage that, yeah, we're going to get more. There's going to be more, and they're going to be increasingly impressive, and we're probably going to get some that are going to be like mega high-dimensional matches. And that's all true. We'll see all that structure as we go through it. Now it blows up. Now, hold on. Do we get a bit of handedness there, in fact? Let's take this at 0.25x, since we're zeroing in on a read here, possibly. So this adds to the dimensionality of the match, in my opinion. We get the momentary implication of a person's head on fire. This is an aspect of the projection space. Heads on fire, red heads. If we were to position this figure in the N tower, or excuse me, so used to N being on this side, if we were to position this figure in the S tower position, which is to say it's being representative ultimately of the explosion, then that would make this figure Mr. N. I do note that he's wearing a blue shirt, which would make him consistent with the color coding on that side of the projection space. So it lightly tracks, but I suppose he is the one who holds the smoke here as well. I really wish that the dynamite was here. That ought to be in the S position for perfect alignment. However, the fact that the smoke gets associated with this figure, it does create a fairly nice N and S pair here. So in fact, I think there's even a bit of extra dimensionality. Now, I was just interested in terms of where this explosion... Oh, look, it does blow up on that side. So, it's again, we have multiple planes here. We have 3 replications of the image aligned together. This one achieves correct-handedness, in fact. There's a correctly handed S. N isn't coded in and of itself, it's just coded relatively. Looking at these skeletons, they have... Yeah, shit, Interesting. They have poles sticking out of their heads, and they have this kind of structure, and their kind of skeletons are like black and white, which codes the color space on that side. So overall, too, on the what I sometimes call the global plane, we have correct-handedness. If we think of this as grokking elements of the North Tower image structure, that's a pretty okay N over there, I'd say. you kind of want to pull in this texture detail a bit there and say that that tracks lightly. And then we have the explosion on this side, which includes in it sort of a double gridded rectangle pair, correctly handed there again. So the global frame is correctly handed. This inner plane is correctly handed. These guys also constitute a nicely differentiated S and N pair, but they exist in an inversion. So yeah, I don't know. That's a fair amount going on there. In fact, oh, we get it a second time here, and it kind of again it does that here. It goes up on this side here. Yeah, that's quite clearly handed there. Now, what is this frame? This is an interesting thing here. What that's all about? Is that a fireplace, maybe? That's like a tin head, helmet head. He also appears here next to a Solomonic column. See that there? Sense of double torches, and there is a red candle here as well. Interesting. And now we're right back into sort of Gerardian sacrifice territory again here, you know? Here we have this animal, and we have this person feasting on the animal in this very bloodthirsty way. Red candle again in the background. You know, sort of gray, this thing here, then the red candles clustered here, the animal and the eating of the animal with the blood. This is all very S-y. So this is another correctly handed frame. And, you know, each time we get one of these, it's just the global probability estimate. So, you know, already I want to talk about the probability things now, because in fact we're right in the middle of a bunch of matches somehow, impossibly. I didn't kind of think actually we were going to be right in the middle of match territory. But I want to wait until we get some more kind of, some clearer instantiations of it or something. Now we have three figures. Here's this vampire wife. Is that Dracula's bride, I guess? Now we have all the candles over here. How many exist here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Really? 7? Am I missing one? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Seems like maybe there's an 8 back there. 1, 2, 3, 4, over here. How many steps? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, eh? 5 there, 8 here. That's tentative. This might have more or less candles now. You know, doesn't mean anything to me, but it's good to perform these checks. His head comes in pretty close alignment with that torch again. So this might be helpful later, you know, because Van Helsing appears, I think, towards the end of the film. He would seem to be a very strong N resonator, given the presence of the following aspects, qualities. He's bearded, so that tracks the North Tower wound. He wears black and white, that tracks the North Tower color space. Particularly aspects to do with the antenna, which had high contrast, black-white alternation. And he holds this kind of vertical arrow thing, which also tracks the notion of the antenna. So I'm going to call her Bride of Dracula. Bride of Dracula bares her teeth. I find this image to be pretty arousing. Then we cut to Van Helsing again, who I think just murders her like right away. I want to note that there's, stake through the heart. This is such a kind of brutal thing. I mean, I know she's supposed to be a monster and all this, but really it's like they just kind of like burst into this place while she was eating dinner. And then like just murder her in cold blood. Like they didn't even ask her any questions or like anything, you know, just like completely, just like maximum violence, like 0 to 100 miles per hour, you know, or maybe we should say 88 miles per hour. Keep it in the reference space. It's a funny thing with these movies. I feel the same way about this movie that I do about many of John Carpenter's films. It feels like they're deliberately trying to build some sympathy with the monsters. It's as if the film is endeavoring to support a dual reading. We can somehow imagine this in a different way, that in fact Bride of Dracula and maybe Dracula are the true victims in this scenario, because the film is kind of, it's not done anything to justify the supposed monstrousness of the monsters, at least not at this stage. We haven't seen Dracula do anything. We don't even know who this character is, really. As soon as we've been introduced to this bride character, like, she's immediately gunned down by Van Helsing. What we had was that, like, text crawl in the middle that sort of told us, like, oh, these are freedom fighters, they're going to rid the world of evil. But then within the reality that the film shows us, we don't see any actual justifications of that. We don't see any of that evil. It remains kind of outside of the narrative frame, and just asks you to take the film's word for it, sort of on its authority. So I find that very interesting, given the way that this scene develops. We're going to have a lot of kind of reading of text in a desperate, frantic way in connection with this giant uncertainty vortex portal thing. Anyway, I'm jumping the gun. Now, I should say, I don't think that this film really works in the way that, like, a Carpenter film works. I'm quite convinced Carpenter has designed certain films to have this Janus-like quality. That the possibility of performing this kind of perspective inversion in his films, like, yields such perfect results, typically, that it almost had to have been engineered that way. I don't have that sense about Monster Squad. I just had these weird little glimpses in it of, like, it's like strange. It's like this violence directed at this woman, you know. It's such a weird image, too, of her, like, eating this animal. It does, to me, like, evoke ideas about sacrifice, which makes one think about victims and scapegoating and who says who's evil and so on. Well, and then the film does sort of eventually raise these sorts of issues, because it does things like it places a Holocaust survivor into the narrative with the old scary German guy character. And it goes out of its way to show us that he's a Holocaust survivor and say, this isn't a supposed comedy, like 80s, like Goonies knockoff kind of comedy. Why is the film showing us anything like that, So it's a difficult one for that reason. It's very hard to establish kind of the layers of authorship in it. Certain artifacts have a sort of, let's say, a sedimentary structure like this that's quite clear. Other ones are quite muddled. And this one, it's incredibly, like, I have no idea what's conscious here, what isn't. It's also, on the one hand, kind of seamlessly interwoven, and on the other hand, kind of so internally autonomous, because it seems like it's doing so many things at once in a kind of layered, simultaneous way. Well, so anyway, it's already kind of happening, because now we're looking at this insane image. We're looking at an instantiation of a hierarchy here. I mean, just look at all these steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It looks like we have 14 or maybe 15 steps. I have to think about what the significance of that might be, if anything. But it's clearly kind of a pyramidal sacrifice mountain, framed with double red triangles, like these candles sum to triangular structures. It's a red twins thing, it's a blood pyramid thing, it's flanking this big thing that then also has double reds. These two candles here. And in the middle, this jewel, which we we later learn is the sort of force of pure concentrated good, something like that. But remember what I was talking about in the Blood Pyramids video when I was essentially using the notion of cybernetic sort of counter-regulation as defined by Ashby in his paper about the law of requisite variety. Remember all that stuff? I was using that to describe the way that belief systems deflect and rationalize away from a confrontation with this point in the middle that is a point of recognition about the nature of the belief system as a construction. I drew it in my video in a way that looks almost exactly like this, and like here it is, like just like baked into the architecture of this set. In a film that then goes on, like I sort of tried to suggest there already, but we'll see along the course of our analysis, goes on to continue to highlight issues to do with hierarchy and suffering again and again and again. So it makes me wonder, like, is it deliberate? It's not like these ideas are so arcane or something, you know, there's plenty of ways one can come to these ideas, you know. Maybe the people who made this film did a bunch of reading on this stuff, and maybe they are deliberately trying to represent it here. On the other hand, that's kind of a little hard to really believe, isn't it? Because it just doesn't seem like it's that kind of film on the whole, but then it kind of does when you look at the details. So these are the sorts of conundrums that might keep you up at night if you join me at this particular depth of the rabbit hole. Okay, directed by Fred Decker. Now, I don't really know much about Fred Decker. I just like that his name introduces a double K here. I'm sure we all know why. And in fact, you know, K2 and all of that, that's a very, like, primordial synchromistic meme. That goes right back to the Jake Kotze stuff. And of course, it graces what still, I would say, is just something so close to the heart of the mystery. All that activity going on at the Circle K, where strange things truly are afoot. So here Van Helsing is staring at the jewel. I think I was correct in describing it as representing concentrated good. But you see, what that has to do with is it has to do with that value matrix we looked at last time. How the valuations are made, that set of, what did Ashby call it? E. This is like a mapping of the Z possible outcomes. He said, oh, look, it may be a simple two-element set. It might be good and bad. So this thing represents pure good, which means that relative to it, we're going to get the sort of the bad definitions. And so this thing remaining protected and static means that the meaning structure as a whole gets to remain that way, because the valuations don't have to change. So it represents the kind of the point of sacred stability in the model network that must not be disturbed. The basic valuation. That's what I'd say about it. And I mean, look at it. Drecker, or whatever his name is, the director of this film, who I don't think has directed very many other films, actually. It's kind of one of those strange one-offs, you know. I mean, he has directed some others, but this is mostly what he's remembered for. And look, he's just like shooting a laser, like a red laser, into the middle of this thing so that it has a bunch of lines that converge into it as a unity. Even Van Helsing is amazed by it. Helsing is an interesting name, no? So the girl, now there has to be a ritual, and the ritual is going to involve a young girl who, I don't know if we learn it here, but eventually we learn it, is explicitly a virgin. This must be a virgin. It's a virgin maiden. So we're orbiting around a ritual sacrifice theme here, quite tightly. Now, why a virgin? Now, I think really most people have, like, there's no such thing as a group that hasn't been considered fair game for sacrifice. Like, so it's a little weird to sort of say something like that. On the other hand, there does seem to be something about the purity of the victim mattering. There's an interesting double tendency here, I would imagine. On the one hand, we want to sacrifice the category C people, right? Thinking back to all that stuff, just to say the underclass. And they are just kind of the de facto sacrifice, because we went through all this in the other video. If the society was structured in a different way, it would privilege different people and disadvantage different people. And then you'd have different people in these compartments. So the fact that the way of life is in this particular configuration means that particular people get shunted into these different positions in the hierarchy. And so, you know, They're kind of literally the sacrifices to the thing as it's organized. But also there seems to be a tendency to want to sacrifice people out of category A as well. Now, in what this film actually presents us, this girl is not being literally sacrificed. It's not a sacrificial ritual explicitly. What she has to do in this ritual is she has to read this bunch of text. Just because she has to kind of read a spell aloud. But the fact that there's this requirement that she must be a virgin, and that we see this animal slaughtered and eaten, we see this visual representation of a hierarchical pyramid. Again, just the context of Dracula and what Dracula means, and all this business with the protection of the center. And then what also ends up happening in the scene, which is the big entropy vortex opens up. All of these things together, to me, suggests that we're dealing with strongly suggests we're dealing with a sacrificial scenario at the unconscious, implicit level. And maybe even at the consciously worked thematic, sort of deep structural thematic level of the film as architected by the authors. Again, hard to say with this one. So she starts reading in German. I tried to look up this stuff online to see if we could get like a translation of the material. It's very fragmentary, and it would seem that a lot of it is kind of just gibberish German. But right there she says, Ich glaube, which means I believe. So belief is highlighted there in the text. Overall, I think there's a kind of strange Hickox vibe to this section of the film. That's just, Hickox loved these medieval settings and so on. So the windows blow out, and then the foundation itself begins to rumble. And note that we see this particular thing happening here in very close proximity to the corpse of Dracula's bride. Remember, I was suggesting that this was perhaps a kind of an act of unjustifiable violence in some way. It's like no sooner have they done that somehow the belief system itself starts threatening to break apart. That's being represented here in the form of this what seems to be this kind of church, like literally collapsing. But it's also like the dead. The dead begin to rise from their graves here. The dead that were, let's say maybe the innocent dead that were slain sacrificially. And this is, Gerard speaks quite a bit about the dead. Something like that. We'll need to be a little more thorough in our reading of him probably along the way. But like I said, we've got a long time to get through this movie. We're 5 minutes into this movie. Even though we've been talking for probably over 2 hours now. We're getting close to it. So here come the rising dead. Something I would like to say here also about this stuff. There's something the matter with the figure of Elijah in relation to all of this business. First of all, it is Elijah that Jung identifies with the prophet in the Red Book. Elijah is a figure that exists in a kind of layered transparency, if you know what I mean, with Philemon, another logos-bearing masculine figure that Jung encounters in his adventure through the unconscious. It's ultimately Philemon that Jung thinks is responsible for composing the 7 Sermons to the Dead and many portions of the Red Book. It's my terrible attempt to draw Philemon here. That's that's really what he thought. Jung considered those writings to have been channeled. And so, okay, here's Philemon. But then back here is Elijah. And Jung meets with Elijah first. He's the earlier figure. Elijah's paired with Salome in Jung's visions. the Elijah that Jung encounters is a particular sort of Elijah, who exists obviously in associative relation with the biblical Elijah. But I want to talk now about the biblical Elijah briefly. Say a few things about him. First thing I want to say about him is that he exists in connection with the first instance of, essentially, of necromancy in the Old Testament. Right? Because Elijah revives the dead child of the widow. And that's one of the, I think, kind of one of the first contexts in which we meet Elijah, is he's raising the dead. This is something that gets picked up on again, obviously, with Christ, who also raises the dead. And in fact, Christ even journeys to hell and continues his redemptive work there. But it's also the case that during the transfiguration of Christ, which is a very strange portion of that myth set, because it's somehow about it's the moment in which a transparency is achieved between the image of Christ and Christ's divinity. And now that's a very... something about that would bear much deeper consideration, I think. But during the Transfiguration, Elijah appears, in fact, along with Moses. And there's such sort of an initial, I don't know if confusion is quite the right word, but kind of to-do about that, oh my God, Elijah has appeared here. That there's some, I will say confusion about whether or not Christ might, in some sense, be simply the reincarnation of Elijah. I think it's more to the point that Elijah represents the lineage of the prophets, and then Moses represents the law, because he bears the tablets, of course. So it's about these two aspects merging together into the figure of Christ. We have the logos-oriented, law-based side, and then we have the divinatory, necromancing, prophesying, visionary, clairvoyant, etc., side represented by Elijah. And also a side that has quite a bit to do with ritual sacrifice, because one of the main big stories to do with Elijah is the stuff that happens on Mount Carmel. And now I'm trying to remember here. Incidentally, do you know that I grew up on Mount Carmel? Literally, grew up on the base of it. Elijah's cave and all that, so kind of, right around my zone of the world. In any case, what happened on that mountain, according to the biblical accounts, is in the context of the priests of Baal, I believe. It was like a test, basically, between two sacrificial altars. The priests of Baal, this other god, made their altar, and Elijah made his altar to Yahweh, I guess. And the notion was God will ignite the altar of the true God. And this is all in the context of this bigger story, to do with trying to sort of, Elijah's kind of attempting to unify the belief system around a monotheistic point once again. Kind of say, look, you can't really have it two ways. We can't have all this worship of this other god, and then also, what's going on here? So we'll put it to a test once and for all. We'll build these two altars and see what happens. And I believe what happens, like the priests, they go all out on their altar. I think it even describes them like they cut themselves and they bleed. They even they put their own blood into the thing. And then Elijah sets up his altar. Lo and behold, it's like a beam of fire shoots down from the sky and ignites Elijah's altar. And then I think he immediately orders all the priests of Baal to be killed. He has them slaughtered, and then Jezebel has Elijah chased out of the society for that, basically. It happens if you're a magician doing things like this. Critically, Elijah was a miracle worker, like Christ then becomes. You can see why the desire why the alignment between Elijah and Christ is so strong, and why maybe in a sense Christ really is the return of Elijah in some kind of way within the context of that myth, So those are some things about the biblical Elijah. We mentioned the Jungian Elijah. I now want to mention the Elijah that appears in the Alex Winter film, Freaked. Elijah is the king of the freaks, and some kind of a miracle worker, I would say, in that myth. For some reason is named Elijah, and for some reason exists in the context of a whole lot of red twins symbolism. And if we're thinking perhaps increasingly about the red twins as coding something to do with sacrificial substitution, that's a very ominous thing to find indeed in a film that is also packed to the gills with high-dimensional 9/11 image matches. Why do we find Elijah existing in association with that material? Well, it must pertain somehow to the link via sacrifice. And so, we have the raising of the dead here, and so that to me conjures, in this meta sort of way, the specter of Elijah himself. Elijah represents an aspect of spirituality, precisely the aspect of spirituality that is being reborn, let's say, in the sync movement, at least to some degree. Because I would say that sort of Elijah and Moses showing up at the Transfiguration, that must be caught up in a hemispheric myth. I can't imagine it isn't. Moses is the law. He has the tablets with all the language. So he's the one that tracks the left hemisphere, and then Elijah's the one that sees all the patterns and predicts the future thereby, and works the miracles and raises the dead. So he's obviously the right hemisphere. And they join together in a union, which produces Christ, and the transfiguration of Christ, in which he becomes transparent with the image of divinity. So, I think that's present here. I don't think it's just a zombie. The zombie appears in a very weird context to do with this jewel that represents the source of all good in the world, and a ritual that must be performed with the Virgin that has to read a bunch of language while this big vortex opens that ends up sucking everything into it. Like maybe that's like an entropy collapse in a model network, like a belief system, see? It's very difficult, I think, to watch a scene like this at this speed. I'm talking now literally about like watching it at 0.25x or so on, and not notice the organization of the elements. You might not be able to interpret it, and we're struggling at the moment to interpret all this stuff here. There's a lot of strange threads coming together here, it seems to me. But this is why I want to like encourage the practice, you know. I want to encourage the practice of watching these things in this very slow, kind of so detail-oriented, maybe or psychotic kind of way. It's not psychotic. It's taking notice of a different sort of intelligence that cohabitates human creative work. And in this case, I have to say, for like the millionth time, I really have to wonder about whether or not some of these things weren't placed here consciously, because look at this. It conforms so clearly to a kind of, here's opposite 1, here's opposite 2, like Boaz and Yakin, the pillars, etc., and here's the weird non-dual unity source in the middle. Back in the early days of this channel, we used to call a 191
opposites,
numeric glyph match.
They always come in pairs,
and indeed, it is that kind of
in
match. So we do have that kind of number implicitly coded here as well. We get more rising of the dead. You see, somehow I feel already, you know, it's like this. The film contains a key to understanding the nature of the dead. You know, there's more in this still. I'm not sure quite how to nudge it into surfacing yet, but I don't know. I'm optimistic. I think it was like "Tout me ve" or something, like don't hurt us, something like that. I took a couple semesters of German in college because I wanted to read Heidegger. I never really got very good with it. My Hebrew is better, much better. I guess that in the kind of the narrative structure, the opening of this vortex is the result of the successful enactment of that ritual, maybe. But it seems that maybe just opening the vortex isn't enough to kind of pull off what's going on here. I don't know. There's a lot of interesting ambiguity here because now I think we see Van Helsing get sucked into this vortex. Oh, does the child herself get sucked into it? Ah, so you see, in fact, I was wrong. This is even more conformant than we initially thought, because she is ultimately sacrificed. Look, she gets sucked down into the uncertainty rabbit hole here. Also, what a terrifying image, actually. What's this thing? A torch falls on this side. And then here's the sacrificed child. Framed along with the red twins here. Yeah, it's kind of hanging around on that side. So I would say that's an antenna tracking element, projection space wise. And this is an S element on the whole. He seems bothered, but not too bothered, you know. I guess he's got his hands full with the dead. Look at this. Oh, she gets sucked into it as well. This is amazing. Now, I'm going to throw something out there. I'm not sure if this is going to hold up in the long run, but I keep thinking about it. We've got A, we've got B, we've got C. What's beneath C? The dead, of course. B for dead. Because these are the ones who have been ultimately sacrificed, you see. The ones who were living in the terrible bottom rung of the blood pyramid. You know, beneath the foundation of the blood pyramid, that's where the dead are. A and B often fear an uprising of C. But they also fear by extension a potential uprising of D. Particularly of the dead C's. If you know what I mean. We're full of these accidental strange puns tonight. Let that be a measure of how flipped I really am about this stuff. This reminds me so much of kind of the poltergeist stuff where we see all these shots of the family interacting with the dead skeletons. Actual human remains in that case. That would not happen probably in a film production today. So this is amazing, I think, like as an effect. I love how this looks. I find it's very convincing. You can see they've matted in these levitating elements, you know. Again, we have it framed between double flaming objects. Okay, that's the intro to this film. I think I'm going to break for tonight. I do want to catch just this little bit of the transition, though, to show that we go immediately from that to looking at a school that it tells us is now present day. The fact that this opens in a school is just almost perfect, you know, from the standpoint of being a film maybe about belief systems and model collapse and all this kind of stuff. We're right in the sort of the center of the society's indoctrination systems, school. Here we are. And here we are with double red doors. And an antenna, literal antenna. I think this forms a bit of a match again. And now we're going to pan down and we're going to see that there is indeed a redheaded child here. It's right there. There's our little Stewie clone. And we're going to look over here and we're going to see, okay, so now in fact we have 3 doors, so you might think that's a bit of a fudge. But what isn't a fudge is the fact that we have handedness in this group of bicycles over here. We have 2 red ones here and 2 blue ones here. Now hold on, let's be scientific about it. I'm going to pin the video tools up here. Because sometimes these films can be a bit weird about how they catch the light on people, but I don't know. That's looking pretty much like ginger hair to me. What do you think? You be the judge. I'm saying that's red hair, though. At least by way of subliminal implication. Okay, if we go too much further, I'm going to have to get into the big entropy discussion. We'll save that for the next session. I want to thank everybody for hanging out, as usual. And I will see you in the future. Bye.